Well, for those of you who were here 2 weeks ago, we did see that video. I don't know why it's not working now, but last week, Austin at the park started our sermon series on the 10 words. And for those of you who weren't here or don't remember from last week, it's basically the 10 words are the 10 commandments. However, when we really understand what they are, it's not about being commandments, it's more about God speaking to the people about the expectations that he has for them being his people. That when you really read through the 10 commandments, it's not so as much you shall as it's you will do these things. That if you really are the people of God, then these are the kinds of things that you're going to be doing. And ultimately, when you read them elsewhere in the Old Testament, they're referred to as the 10 words. And so that's the main idea of what we want you to understand, is that their 10 words are really messages from God that are being communicated to help understand what it really means to be his people. And so we're going to be going through this section of Exodus chapter 20 and looking at them and what God is really trying to communicate to the people. And we'll be explaining to you a little bit about how they would have understood these different words back in their times, how it's found throughout the rest of the Bible, and how that idea functions, as well as what it means to us today, because it has just as much meaning to us as it did to them. That if you would have seen the end of the video, it's the 10 words from Moses to Jesus, and it really describes the entirety of what God expects of his people of all times, not just for the people of Israel as they went from Sinai and into the land, but for God's people into the New Testament and beyond. And so the first one we have here is, I am irreplaceable. And if you don't fully understand how that title works, go and read Exodus 3 to kind of understand what exactly is happening there. But it also describes what we typically know as the first commandment and what it's all about. And we'll see that as we go through this and look at it and what it's really trying to communicate and how God is irreplaceable and why that truly matters to what we're doing. The first commandment here is, okay, now it's not working. There we go. Typically, when you see it, it's found something. It says something similar to this: "You shall have no other gods before me." Sometimes it also says, "You shall have no gods beside me." And so, again, we typically think about this in the sense of having just God as our God and no others. And obviously, that's one way to understand this. But if we really look at it, the word before there has multiple meanings and understandings that we can take just from the English word. You know, it can mean before in the sense of something happened before another thing. It can mean how we typically take this of ranking and something being before or above something else. Or it can also be like the idea that right now I am standing before you guys. Basically, I'm standing in front of you, or even the idea of being in your presence. And so all of those are different ways to understand it. And while this isn't necessarily what we would call a bad translation, if we really want to understand what's being communicated, what it's really saying is basically, there will not be, or it will not be for you, other gods before my face. It actually takes that last idea of in God's presence or before him or like right in front of him, of not having those other gods before him, that's really the idea that is actually being communicated there. And obviously, because God's presence was with them always and really is with all people, it's really just at all times anyways, but it still carries the idea that it's something about being done in front of him or to his face or being done directly at him, of having those other gods. But one of the ways that we really get our understanding of it actually comes from the Greek translation of this, where it says, there will not be for you other gods more than or except me. That at that point in time, they began to understand the idea of what this meant as even being just above him or besides him in general. That this is probably where we begin to get our idea of what we think of when we hear this commandment, when we hear this, the very first commandment of those here. And so it's not as if that's not present in the idea, but there's more to it than that. And if we really want to understand what is being communicated, we have to go back to Genesis 2 and 3, which again, really everything goes back there. But when we look at the story of Adam and Eve and what is happening there, we find that in chapter 2, when it's describing the garden and everything that happens, it says that God planted trees that were desirable to the eyes and desirable to the flesh. And we find that when Eve looks at the fruit and eats it, that she says those two things, but then there's one more that is said in the midst of that is desirable to make one wise, which is closely connected to what Satan or the serpent is telling Eve, that they'll become like God when they eat of it. And that is the thing that really is the temptation that leads them to eat of it. And so what's happening here is that they were wanting something that God was not giving them. They wanted the knowledge of good and evil. They wanted to be more like God, even though God had already created them to be like him. And so they weren't accepting what he had provided for them, but they were looking for more. They were looking for what, in essence, they could provide for themselves rather than what he was giving them. They wanted more than what they were being given. And that becomes the problem of why God actually says this, that they are to have no other gods, because it would lead them to a point where they wouldn't clearly understand where what they're being given is coming from. They'll begin to think it's coming from these other gods rather than from God himself, and they'll misunderstand what God has been doing all along. And we can see this idea when we look through the rest of the Bible, and specifically in the prophets and a lot of what they talk about, that it becomes very clear. One of the best examples that I found is in Hosea chapter 2. And if you don't know, the book of Hosea has the prophet Hosea going and marrying a woman who's a prostitute, and then her being unfaithful to him, and he has to go and buy her back again after that. And in the midst of that, in the first few chapters, God uses that, basically that what Hosea is doing as an example to what the people of Israel had done to God. And it says here, for their mother has played the harlot. She who conceived them has acted shamefully. For she said, I will go after my lovers who give me my bread and my water, my wool and my flax, my oil and my drink. Therefore, behold, I will hedge up her way with thorns, and I will build a wall against her so that she cannot find her paths. So she will pursue her lovers, but she will not overtake them, and she will seek them, but will not find them. Then she will say, I will go, and I will return to my first husband, for it was better for me then than now. And what we find here is when she says, I will go after my lovers who give me all of these things, that it is within those other gods that the people of Israel were thinking that they were being provided with everything that they had. Ultimately, what happened is that when they got into the land, they didn't do a good enough job driving out the people who were there, and they remained there, and they continued within their practices of worshiping these other gods. And things seemed to be going well enough for them in their practices of how they got the rains to come so they could get harvests and all of that. And so the people of Israel saw that and thought that that must be the way that they do it. And originally, they probably were just incorporating that in their worship to God, but somewhere along the way, they completely abandoned that and just began worshiping these other gods and doing those things. And things went well enough for them, and it seemed like they were being provided these things just like the rest of the people from these gods that they were worshiping. And so they started rejecting God's provision for them and sought it out in all of these other gods. And so God responds here and says, "Now she does not know that it was I who gave her the grain, the new wine, and the oil, and multiplied silver and gold for her, which they used for Baal. Therefore I will take back my grain at harvest time, and my new wine in its season. I will also deliver my wool and my flax from them, given to cover her nakedness." And so God responds that they did not know that it was him who was providing for them all along, that even in their misdeeds, God was still providing all of these things for them, but because they were unable to recognize that it was coming from him, he's going to have to do something different. So he's going to take it away from them, and ultimately he's going to send them into exile so that it will become clear to them that they were not rightly recognizing it, that they were not recognizing that God is the provider for them and not all of these other gods. And that, again, really becomes the reason for why God would say to not have any other gods before him, because, again, they'll get mixed up. They won't rightly understand who's providing for them, who's giving them what they have. And so God has to be the provider of it. But it's not just seeking after other gods that they had problems with, but even closer to what we do, they also had problems with thinking that they could provide things for themselves. And so Moses points that out to them in Deuteronomy when he's speaking to them before they enter the land. And he says, "Beware lest you forget Yahweh your God by not keeping his commandments and his judgments and his statutes, which I am commanding you today. Lest you eat and are satisfied, and build good houses and live in them, and your herds and your flocks multiply, and your silver and gold multiply, and all that you have multiplies, and your heart becomes lifted up, and you forget Yahweh your God, who brought you out from the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. He led you through the great and fearsome wilderness with its fiery serpents and scorpions and thirsty ground where there was no water. He brought water for you out of the rock of flint. In the wilderness he fed you manna, which your fathers did not know, that he might humble you and that he might test you to do good for you in the end, lest you say in your heart, my power and the might of my hand has made me this wealth. But you shall remember Yahweh your God, for it is he who is giving you power to make wealth, that he may confirm his covenant, which he swore to your fathers, as it is this day. And so we see the problem is that they thought they were providing all of these things themselves, that when they entered the land, got settled down, and everything was going well for them, they would think that they were the ones providing for themselves, rather than God being the one that was providing. And so Moses is letting them know ahead of time of this problem, and so he's telling them to remember God so that they don't fall into this trap, so they don't end up at this place where they think they are the ones providing for themselves. It really reminds me of what happens in Daniel chapter 4, where Nebuchadnezzar is looking out over his kingdom and thinks that he's the one who has built it all up and has provided all the stuff for himself, when really, in fact, it is God who even gave him the kingdom in the first place. And so God humbles him by making him an animal eating grass for a period of time until he's able to recognize God as the one in authority. And so God proves to him that God was the one who provided it, not Nebuchadnezzar himself. And so it's the same idea that the people of Israel were going to think of this, and they were going to forget God's provision, which again ultimately led them to thinking that these other gods were providing for them as well. And the final scripture I have here is out of the New Testament in Revelation, in what are typically called the letters to the seven churches, and this is the very last one written to the church of Laodicea. And he says there, because you say, I am rich, and I have been rich, and I have no need, even you do not know that you are the miserable one and a pitiable one, and poor and blind and naked. I am stirring you up to buy from me gold, having been burned out of fire, in order that you might be rich, and white clothing, in order that you might throw it around yourself, and might not reveal the shame of your nakedness, and eye salve to smear on your eyes, in order that you might see. And so it's the same idea here, as they thought they could provide all these things for themselves, but really that hadn't been the case at all. And really it's actually being played off here is what happened earlier in the history of Laodicea itself, that some years prior, there had been an earthquake that had destroyed much of the area, and things needed to be rebuilt. And so Rome was offering to help that, to provide money and all of that for the people. And the people in Laodicea said, "We don't need your help." They were so rich that they didn't actually need the help of Rome to be able to rebuild, while many of the cities and other places around them did need that. And so God's basically playing off that and saying the same way that you people in your history rejected aid from Rome, you Christians who are there are rejecting God and his provision that he has provided for you. And so it's that very same idea, is that they thought that they were providing for themselves. They thought that they had everything they needed, but they actually missed the point because they had rejected God being the one who was actually providing for them. And it stands in contrast to what is found in actually the second letter to the church in Smyrna, where he says, "I know of you the affliction and the poorness, nevertheless you are rich." That they were going under persecution and struggling hardship in many different ways in Smyrna, but they were trusting in God throughout all of this. So thus, they were actually rich in the way that matters, where the people in Laodicea were not rich because they didn't recognize the source, that God was the source behind all of it. And so that's really what it boils down to, is we have to recognize God as being the source of everything. And that's what he's trying to communicate through the first commandments of "you shall have no other gods before me," is the fact that they are supposed to be recognizing that he's the one who's providing for them and ultimately accepting that provision. And so we can see that this thing has to be understood to us in a similar way, that we also have to recognize God as being the one who is providing for us. And it's easy for us to say that because we don't have gods in the same way that they did, that this commandment doesn't really apply to us. All we have to do is recognize him as being God or something along those lines. But we miss the point that though we don't personify or give characteristics and a name and all that stuff to gods like they did, we still ultimately have gods in a similar way. Even more so, we have what they would have considered a national god, because they had national gods, maybe tribal or city gods, and also household ones. That they had different kinds of gods that different things ultimately happened with. But this one more applies to the idea of having national gods, or even some of the other ones, but we would tend to think that we don't really have that today because, we don't really worship anything, or we don't have any specific person or deity, I guess you would say, that we worship. But yet, we do have concepts and ideas that in some way we actually worship and serve in ways we don't realize. Obviously, I would think that the first one that we would have to think of in any government would be greed. And it's not just greed for money, but greed for power, money, and fame. That those things really ultimately drive us, not just in this country, but in all countries, but very specifically in this country. That it's all about having more and more and more, about being able to either, if you don't have power, then you have to at least have fame, or some kind of fame or money or something that makes you better or greater than the people around you. And again, it becomes very clear that we think we are providing ourselves with those things rather than God providing us with what we actually have. That it very easily leads us into that same trap that they had. Again, it might not be thinking of worshiping a God, but it's still that same idea, is that we're so chasing after those things that we miss God being the one who's providing all of it for us in the first place. And so that's one of the ways, but there's also the idea of identity. And it's not just about people identifying a certain way or claiming something that, again, we would think would be sinful or wrong, but it's about identities in general. Is that the way our culture and world exists today is that you're supposed to have some kind of thing that identifies you, that separates you out from other people, or actually connects you or unifies you with others. And you have to do whatever that group or community does in order for you to continue to stay a part of it. And if you don't do that, then ultimately you lose that community that you had before. And so it can become a God in that sense, that you have to continue to put yourself into that, into following along the lines and traditions or whatever else that are guiding that identity, and that pulls you away from being able to serve God the way that you want. And again, it can even be what we would consider a good identity that does the same thing, because unless it's actually claiming to be a servant of God, then we're chasing after something that's not truly being identified with him, even if there are similarities between them. And the final way that we often do this is in putting our hope in the government. And it's done by most people who live in this country, that they get so caught up in all of the elections and all the politics and all that stuff, that as long as the people that they're in agreement with are in control, then everything is going to go good in the land, that everything is going to, that they're going to be comfortable, they're going to have what they want, they're not going to have any of these worries. And again, it doesn't take too much of looking at history to realize it doesn't really matter who's in control or who's doing what. Things still happen that are not good toward us. That the government has no way of truly saving us, but yet there still are many, and even Christians, who like to put their hope in the government over actually putting their hope in God. Again, like what you compare to the people in Laodicea, that they were putting their hope in their riches and all these things rather than God, instead of being like the people of Smyrna, who trusted God even when they were going through hardships. That it really sometimes comes down to where one's putting their hope when things are struggling, or when they don't know what they're going to do, that helps show where one's hope is. Because again, so many will put it into the government or into the politicians who are on their side of being able to fix all of these things, when in reality none of that's ever going to be fixed. And so when we come back to this idea of I am irreplaceable and God being irreplaceable, we have to see this reality that it goes to whether or not we're accepting or rejecting God's provision. That God is irreplaceable because he is the provider. He's the one who created all things, and so he provides not just the things we have, but life itself. And because of that, he is irreplaceable, and that nothing else can take the place of him when it comes to all of that. And so that's what we really need to recognize in this, is that God is the provider, and we need to recognize him as such. And we need to not be like the people of Israel and reject the provision that he's given in one way or another, but we need to accept it and live within it. We need to see what he has done for us, accept that, and trust him that no matter what is coming our way, that he's going to provide for us. That even in the hard times, he's going to provide for us. And in the good times, even when it seems like ourselves or something else is providing for us, it's still God who's ultimately behind all of that. And so that's what we need to recognize, the irreplaceableness of God, because he's the only one who can truly provide for us always, always.